Why California's Pelican Bay Prison was called legal torture. Northern California has a coastline that feels almost untouched by the modern world. Cold Pacific winds sweep through forests of towering redwoods. Fog rolls in thick from the ocean, swallowing the landscape in a quiet gray silence. Small towns dot the region, separated by miles of empty wilderness. It's beautiful. But it's also isolated. And in 1989, that isolation became the perfect place to build one of the most controversial prisons in American history. Pelican Bay State Prison. From the outside, the prison looks like any other high-security facility: concrete buildings, fences topped with razor wire, watchtowers scanning every corner of the perimeter. But deep inside the complex was a building unlike almost anything that had existed before in the United States. A place designed with a single purpose in mind: total, near-permanent isolation. Inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, known simply as the SHU, men could spend years inside a concrete room without ever touching another human being. No handshakes. No hugs. No physical contact at all. Some prisoners would remain there for so long that entire decades of their lives would pass without meaningful conversation. Officials described the SHU as a necessary tool to control violent prison gangs. But prisoners who lived inside those cells described it very differently. To them, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was something closer to psychological warfare. And the question that would eventually echo through courts, protests, and political debates across America was simple. At what point does punishment become torture? The answer begins inside a building designed to remove almost every part of normal human life. The security housing unit at Pelican Bay was not built like traditional prison housing. Most prisons, no matter how strict, still allow some level of social interaction. Inmates might share cells, eat meals together, work prison jobs, or spend time in recreation yards with others. The SHU removed nearly all of that. Each prisoner was placed inside a single concrete cell roughly 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. The walls were thick poured concrete. The floor was concrete. Even the bed was a slab of concrete attached to the wall. A thin mattress was the only soft surface in the entire room. Mounted beside the bed sat a stainless steel toilet and sink combination. Above it, a small metal mirror was bolted to the wall, so dull it barely reflected anything clearly. There were no real windows. Instead, a narrow frosted panel near the ceiling allowed in a faint gray light that never revealed what was happening outside. A prisoner could not see the sky. They could not see the horizon. They could not even see the prison yard. Just concrete. And steel. And silence. The door sealing the cell was solid metal, except for a small rectangular slot near the middle. That slot served multiple purposes. Food trays were pushed through it. Handcuffs were applied through it. And sometimes, prisoners tried to shout through it, hoping someone down the corridor might hear. But most of the time, the hallway remained quiet. Because every man in that unit was living the same reality. Alone. For 22 to 24 hours a day. And once that routine began, it rarely changed. A typical day in the SHU began with the sound of metal. Keys rattling. Doors slamming somewhere down the corridor. And the soft scrape of meal carts rolling across the floor. Breakfast arrived early. A plastic tray pushed through the door slot, usually oatmeal, bread, maybe powdered eggs. There were no dining halls in this unit. No tables. No chairs. Prisoners ate alone on the edge of their concrete beds. After breakfast, the hours stretched out endlessly. Unlike inmates in general population, SHU prisoners had almost no structured activities. There were no prison jobs to work. No group classes. No recreational programs. The entire day unfolded inside a space barely larger than a bathroom. Many prisoners developed routines simply to stay mentally stable. Some paced the floor repeatedly. 8 steps forward. Turn. 8 steps back. Over and over again. Others exercised constantly. Push-ups. Sit-ups. Shadowboxing. Anything to burn time. Because inside solitary confinement, time behaves differently. Minutes feel longer. Hours blur together. Days become indistinguishable from each other. For prisoners who remained there for years, the routine could feel almost surreal. But what made Pelican Bay's SHU especially controversial wasn't just the isolation. It was how long prisoners could be kept there. Because unlike many forms of solitary confinement, the SHU often had no clear end date. Most prisoners arrived at Pelican Bay's SHU after being identified as serious security threats. But not all of them had committed violent acts inside prison. Many were sent there through a process known as gang validation. California's prison system believed that powerful prison gangs controlled large parts of inmate activity across the state. Groups like the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla Family had reputations for organizing assaults, drug trafficking, and even murders behind bars. To stop these groups from operating, prison officials developed a strategy. Identify suspected gang members. Then isolate them from the rest of the prison population. Investigators searched for evidence of gang involvement. Sometimes that evidence came from tattoos or coded symbols. Sometimes from letters found in a prisoner's cell. And sometimes from confidential informants, other inmates who agreed to provide information. If enough evidence accumulated, the prisoner could be officially validated as a gang member or associate. And once validated, they could be sent directly to the SHU. Here's where things became controversial. Those placements often had no specific release date. A prisoner could remain in solitary confinement indefinitely. Not for months. Not even for years. But potentially for the rest of their prison sentence. And for many inmates, the only path out of the SHU was something that came with enormous personal risk. Debriefing. Debriefing meant cooperating with prison investigators. A prisoner would be expected to provide detailed information about gang activity inside the prison system. Names of leaders. Communication methods. Operations. Connections to crimes. In other words, they had to become informants. From the perspective of prison officials, this system made sense. Gather intelligence. Break gang power structures. Prevent violence before it happens. But from the perspective of many inmates, debriefing carried a serious danger. Inside prison culture, informing on others could permanently mark someone as a traitor. Even if they were transferred to another facility, word could spread quickly. And once labeled an informant, a prisoner could face retaliation from gang members for the rest of their sentence. Because of that risk, many inmates refused to debrief. Which meant their only alternative was staying inside the SHU. Year after year. And as the years passed, the psychological toll of isolation began to reveal itself in ways few outside observers truly understood. But the effects would eventually become impossible to ignore. Because the human mind was never meant to exist in total isolation. And Pelican Bay was about to show the world exactly what happens when it does. The one moment each day when SHU prisoners left their cells was something guards called recreation. But the word barely captured the reality. Prisoners were escorted in handcuffs down long sterile corridors to small outdoor enclosures. Inmates nicknamed them dog runs. Each yard was a narrow concrete space surrounded by high walls. Above, a metal mesh ceiling allowed a thin strip of sky to be visible. No grass. No equipment. No other people. Just another concrete box. For about 1 hour, prisoners walked circles inside these yards. Some stretched their arms toward the sky, trying to feel sunlight that they rarely saw. Others simply stood still, letting fresh air hit their faces. Then the hour ended. Handcuffs returned. The walk back down the corridor began. And the cell door closed once again. For prisoners who spent years inside the SHU, this brief walk outside became one of the only markers of time passing. But slowly, something else was happening behind those walls. Something that would eventually shake the entire California prison system. Because the prisoners inside Pelican Bay were beginning to organize. And what they planned to do next would bring international attention to one of the most secretive prison units in America. Over time, the greatest battle inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit was not between inmates and guards. It was between prisoners and their own minds. Solitary confinement had existed in prisons for centuries. But the scale and duration used at Pelican Bay was something different. Psychologists who later studied the unit described it as an experiment in extreme human isolation. Inside those 8-by-10-foot cells, men could go years without touching another person. Not a handshake. Not a pat on the shoulder. Not even an accidental bump in a crowded hallway. For social creatures like humans, that absence of contact can slowly begin to unravel the mind. Prisoners began reporting symptoms that sounded eerily similar to those experienced by people in long-term sensory deprivation. Some developed intense anxiety. Others described waves of panic that arrived without warning. A sudden noise down the corridor could send their heart racing. The sound of keys. A door slamming. Footsteps. Everything felt amplified. But the most disturbing reports involved hallucinations. Some inmates began seeing shadows move across the walls. Others heard voices that were not there. One former prisoner later explained that after years in isolation, the brain starts searching desperately for stimulation. If it can't find it, it begins creating it. And inside Pelican Bay, there were men who had spent so long alone that reality itself sometimes began to blur. But the prison system did not collapse under these pressures. Instead, the SHU continued operating exactly as it had been designed. Because from the perspective of prison administrators, the unit was working. Violent gang leaders were being separated from the rest of the population. Communication networks were disrupted. Murders inside prisons had been reduced. At least, that was the argument officials made. But critics began asking a different question. If controlling gangs required locking people alone in concrete boxes for decades, what kind of system had been created? And what would eventually happen to the people who lived inside it? The answers to those questions were slowly building behind the walls of Pelican Bay. And eventually, they would explode into one of the most extraordinary protests in American prison history. By the late 2000s, Pelican Bay's SHU had become one of the most restrictive prison units in the United States. Roughly 1,000 inmates lived there at any given time. Many had been inside for more than 10 years. Some had passed 20. And a small number had entered the unit in the early 1990s and never left. Entire generations of prison culture had changed outside those walls. But inside the SHU, time barely moved. One prisoner later described the experience like being buried alive. "You exist," he said. "But the world moves on without you." The isolation also produced an unusual paradox. Inside the general prison population, gangs were typically divided by race and loyalty. Rival groups rarely cooperated. But inside the SHU, those divisions slowly began to blur. Because prisoners from different gangs were living under the exact same conditions. The same concrete cells. The same silence. The same endless years. And through whispered conversations passed along pipes and air vents, something unexpected began to happen. Prisoners started communicating across gang lines. At first, it was simple exchanges. Legal advice. News from outside. But eventually those conversations turned into something much bigger. A shared understanding. That the system holding them there might never change unless they forced the world to pay attention. But how do prisoners trapped in solitary confinement organize a protest? They had no meetings. No phones. No internet. No open contact with each other. Yet somehow, across dozens of isolated cells, a plan began to form. And when it finally happened, the prison system was completely unprepared. On July 1, 2011, something unusual happened at Pelican Bay. Breakfast trays were delivered like always. But many prisoners refused to eat. At first, guards assumed the behavior would pass. Hunger strikes in prison sometimes lasted a day or two before inmates gave up. But this one did not end. Lunch trays were also refused. Then dinner. By the next day, hundreds of prisoners were refusing food. The protests spread rapidly through the SHU. And then something even more unexpected happened. The strike moved beyond Pelican Bay. Prisoners in other California facilities began joining the protest. Within days, thousands of inmates across the state were participating. Some estimates suggested that nearly 6,000 prisoners had stopped eating. Eventually the number would grow to more than 12,000. It became the largest prison hunger strike in American history. The demands were not vague. Prisoners issued a list of 5 core changes they wanted from the California Department of Corrections. An end to indefinite solitary confinement. Fairer standards for identifying gang members. More humane conditions in isolation units. Access to programs and privileges similar to other prisoners. And a pathway out of the SHU that did not require becoming an informant. For the first time, the conditions inside Pelican Bay were being discussed far beyond prison walls. Journalists began investigating. Human rights organizations demanded explanations. Lawmakers started asking questions about what exactly was happening inside the SHU. And the stories they uncovered shocked many people. Because some prisoners had spent more than 2 decades in solitary confinement. But the hunger strike was only the beginning. What followed would bring national attention to Pelican Bay in ways prison officials had never anticipated. As the hunger strike continued, prison officials faced a growing dilemma. If prisoners refused food long enough, their health would begin to collapse. Severe dehydration. Organ failure. Eventually, death. Some inmates were already experiencing dangerous weight loss. Medical staff began monitoring participants closely. But the protest continued. Days passed. Then weeks. The longer the strike lasted, the more attention it attracted from outside groups. Civil rights organizations. Legal advocates. Relatives of prisoners. All began demanding changes to the SHU system. Meanwhile, prison officials maintained that solitary confinement was necessary to control gang violence. Without isolating gang leaders, they argued, the entire prison system could become far more dangerous. Murders inside prisons had historically been linked to gang orders passed through inmate networks. Pelican Bay's SHU, they said, prevented those networks from operating. But critics countered that indefinite solitary confinement carried enormous psychological costs. Some pointed to international human rights standards, which consider long-term isolation to be a form of torture when it exceeds certain limits. And Pelican Bay had prisoners who had lived alone for more than 20 years. The debate quickly escalated into a national controversy. Was the SHU protecting the prison system? Or had it crossed a line into something deeply inhumane? The answer would eventually be decided not just through protests, but through the courts. Because a group of prisoners inside Pelican Bay was preparing to challenge the system legally. And their case would change the future of solitary confinement in California. In 2012, several Pelican Bay prisoners filed a federal lawsuit that would become known as SHU versus Governor of California. The case focused on a central argument: that holding prisoners in indefinite solitary confinement based only on gang affiliation violated the United States Constitution. The plaintiffs included men who had spent decades in isolation. One of them, Todd Ashker, had lived inside the SHU for more than 25 years. Another had spent over 2 decades without physical contact with other inmates. Their lawyers argued that the system created extreme psychological harm, and that prisoners were being held in solitary without meaningful ways to earn release. The case began attracting widespread attention. Experts in psychology testified about the long-term effects of isolation. Researchers described patterns of depression, paranoia, and cognitive decline seen in prisoners held alone for extended periods. Meanwhile, former inmates who had experienced solitary confinement described the mental strain in vivid detail. The courtroom slowly became a stage for one of the largest debates about prison conditions in modern American history. But the outcome would take years. And in the meantime, the hunger strikes continued. Because the men inside Pelican Bay were determined not to let the issue fade from public view. In 2013, another hunger strike began. This time, it spread even further across California's prison system. At its peak, more than 30,000 prisoners reportedly participated. The scale of the protest shocked officials. Entire prisons saw meal trays left untouched. The protest lasted nearly 2 months. By then, the debate over solitary confinement had reached national headlines. Lawmakers began holding hearings. Human rights organizations issued reports. The pressure on California's prison system continued to grow. And eventually, the state reached a settlement. In 2015, California agreed to major changes to its use of solitary confinement. The settlement in the Ashker case effectively ended the policy of placing prisoners indefinitely in the SHU based solely on gang affiliation. Thousands of inmates were reviewed for transfer out of solitary. Many were moved into new step-down programs designed to gradually return them to the general prison population. For some prisoners, it was the first time in decades they had shared space with other people. But the transition was not always easy. Because after 20 or 30 years alone, returning to normal human interaction could feel overwhelming. One former inmate later described his first day outside solitary as terrifying. "There were too many voices," he said. "Too many people moving." For years, silence had been his only environment. Now the world suddenly felt loud. Chaotic. Almost unreal. Pelican Bay's security housing unit still exists today. But the way it is used has changed significantly since the hunger strikes and court rulings. Indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation is no longer the standard practice it once was. Yet the legacy of the SHU remains deeply controversial. For prison officials, Pelican Bay represented an effort to control violent criminal networks operating inside prisons. For critics, it represented a system that pushed punishment to its psychological limits. And for the men who lived inside those cells, the memories of isolation remain impossible to forget. Years spent in silence. In concrete rooms. Watching time pass through a narrow strip of artificial light. Pelican Bay was built to contain the most dangerous prisoners in California. But in doing so, it forced the world to confront a difficult question. How far can a society go in the name of security? Before punishment becomes something else entirely? Because once a person has spent decades alone in a concrete box, the damage may not end when the door finally opens. Pelican Bay was built to hold the most dangerous prisoners in California. But over time, it became something more than just a maximum security prison. For decades, its security housing unit forced the world to confront a difficult question about punishment, power, and human limits. Was it a necessary tool to control violent prison gangs? Or was it a system that pushed isolation further than any human mind was meant to endure? Even after reforms and court rulings, the legacy of Pelican Bay still lingers. Because the debate over solitary confinement didn't end here. It continues in prisons across the world, where thousands of inmates still live in cells not very different from the ones inside this building. And the question remains the same. How much isolation can a human being survive before it becomes something else entirely? Something history might one day look back on very differently.